How does a 13-year-old boy go from simply shining shoes to getting involved with one of the most notorious gangsters on the south side of Chicago and also being involved in a murder investigation within a 24-hour period? Well, stick around because that's exactly what we're going to talk about today on this episode of the Shoeshine Boys. Hey guys, welcome back. So, today we're going to pick things up exactly where we left off last week. If you remember, last week was the very first time that Jimmy actually met Pamela Burns for their very first interview. And during this interview, Jimmy, talks to her for a little bit. She's asking Jimmy some questions, and it becomes very apparent that Jimmy isn't exactly remorseful. Not about those 4 men that he murdered anyway. And Pamela is very upfront with them after the interview. She lets them know that, look, Jimmy, you have a fascinating story, but I don't think you're really a good fit for my series on redemption. The reason being is, well, that you have to have some type of remorse. You can't just commit 4 counts of murder and have no remorse for it and be a good fit for a redemption series, in her mind anyway. But that's okay. Jimmy has no issue with that, other than he's got to deal with the consequences that are going to come from the warden. But he'll handle that. But she does tell him that you have a fascinating story. I've done my research on you. She knows a good bit about Jimmy, and she said, I would love to hear your story. And because you got to remember, Jimmy's never talked about his life to anybody before. He's had many reporters who wanted to find out why he murdered those 4 Crimson King members. Why does a guy like Jimmy, a very successful guy, tons of money, everything at his fingertips, no convictions, no anything, at the age of 28 just decide to go and kill 4 men? Again, there was a lot of speculation that he was involved in organized crime, but never anything that could be linked to him directly. So, he's had a lot of people actually want to tell his story. Over the years, reporters have contacted him, wanting to write books on him, talk about, include him in interviews, things like that. He's turned them all down. Even at his trial, he just put in the plea of guilty after killing those 4 men, sat in silence, and never disclosed exactly or put in any defense to why he did what he did. So Pamela tells him that, look, you're not the right fit for the redemption series. So, but I would really, really love to tell your story. And for some reason, Jimmy feels, I don't know, maybe the timing is right. Maybe he has a connection with her. Maybe he's got some other reason that we're going to find out later. But he decides, okay, I'm willing to go ahead and tell you my story right from the very beginning. And he said, but I got 2 conditions. Primarily, first off, you say nothing to the warden or any of the staff that you're interviewing me for, I guess, my story, my biography. As far as they know, you and I are meeting for me to be included or be considered to be included in your redemption series. As you and I know, the reason for this is, well, because the warden made it very clear that's what he needs. And if he doesn't get that, well, Jimmy's going to face some consequences. His sister's going to face some consequences when she comes to visit him, and Jimmy's going to be moved to out of the protection of his secure cell right now in the Aryan Brotherhood section of the prison, because we're going to find out a lot more about these as things evolve, the Aryan Brotherhood and his relationship with them, and their protection that they're giving him. And the warden said, I'm going to move you to Little Mexico, which is just a way of saying I'm going to move you to the Mexican section of the prison where all the gang members are, Crimson Kings and some of the others. And we know that Jimmy's a marked man. He's killed 4 of their members. So he's not going to have a very good time. Matter of fact, I'd say within 48, 72 hours of arriving there, he's probably going to wind up being shanked to death. So, Jimmy's got to navigate that whole thing and figure out how he's going to, I guess, get the warden off his back, and still be able to, I guess, handling it is in the way that he wants to do it, where he's still in control of his destiny. So he makes a deal with Pamela. Look, I'll give you my story, but you can't say anything to anybody. And he also puts in a request. He says, the only thing I would like to is my attorney, Harold Gordon. You're going to learn a lot more about Harold Gordon. Harold Gordon is Jimmy's attorney and has been for a number of years. And primarily, he wants to make sure that Harold has approval of anything, only because he doesn't want anything to hurt his sister or his niece. He doesn't care about himself, but he feels that they've been dragged through enough over the years, and there's going to be a lot of things that are going to come out in this story, this book that she's going to write on him. She hopes it's going to be a book. She doesn't know yet, but that's what the goal is, and he doesn't want anything that's going to hurt them or cause them any more issues or challenges or, problems. So she agrees to those conditions. So she says, where are we going to start? And he says, well, I can tell you the exact day that changed my life. And she says, was it the day that you killed those 4 men? And Jimmy says, no. And that actually happened 15 years before that. And then it had to end. The meeting had to be over. The guard had to let her know that their time was up. So Jimmy was going to have to continue the story in their next session. So that's where we're going to pick up in chapter 6. It's a continuation. There's Pamela comes back. It's the very next week, and primarily she's there back in the interview room with him again. They greet each other. They have their little banter back and forth, and she says, "Okay, well, look, let's get into it. Last week when we were together, you started to tell me the day that your life changed. You said it had been about 15 years before you had killed those 4 men." And Jimmy starts to tell her the story. And as he goes and he reflects, he goes back into I guess it's a bit of a flashback. And he's a teenager again. He's thinking back in his mind to the day that his world changed. He's about 13 years old. And he tells her that, I remember the day like it was yesterday. It was me and 4 of my best friends. We were out, we were trying to make some extra money hustling. We were shining shoes. We did that from time to time as well as a few other things. But we were always hustling. We were always trying to make a little bit of pocket money. Because we came from one of the more economically depressed parts of the city. And we didn't have nothing. We never had money. We barely scraped by, and that was okay. But we always had to find ways to make some money. So on this particular day, we were out there. We were shining shoes, and I remember it was myself, my best friend Mick. Mick and I were very, very close. He's telling her this. Mick and I were very close. Mick wasn't like the others. The rest of us in our crew. He was a really good student. He came from a broken home where his father had left when he was just small. His father just took off, but his mother was an amazing woman, and Mick had a great relationship with his mother and his younger sister, and she gave him the best home that she could. But because of where they lived on the south side of Chicago and one of the tougher parts of it as well, and which we've talked about before. And look, it wasn't easy. But Mick and Jimmy had been best friends since for years, since they were in first, second grade together. They always clicked, always got on well, and they were very, very tight, almost like brothers to a degree. And even though he might not have been as tough as the others, he was immensely loyal. And, Jimmy is telling all this. He's just kind of describing the boys to Pamela, so she gets a sense of the connection. He says, but, it was me and Mick. There was also Sal Burke. Sal Burke was, he's a unique character. Again, one of the same age, same class as them, 13-year-old boy. Tough kid, real tough kid. As a matter of fact, he's well above average when it comes to size and strength and his ability to fight. He's just a rough, tough kid, and afraid of nothing. Very rough around the edges, but again, good guy. Him, Mick, and Jimmy really tight. And then you have two others. You have Liam, and he's telling Pamela, he says, Liam, his father was still around, but he was a drunk, and he was very vicious, and they had like a lot of kids. I think there was like 14 kids, and the father was just a drunk, the mother was a drunk, and the father would beat him all the time, and it was just a really dysfunctional household, and primarily, he had nothing, and they tell a joke that were primarily, they're all carrying their shoeshine boxes. Little wooden crate boxes with the handle on it that people put their feet on, or their shoes, so they could shine their boots or shoes or whatever. And they carry inside the box as their brushes and rags and polish and all that good stuff. But Liam didn't have a box. He just carried all his stuff around in a bucket, a little metal bucket, that he'd got from someplace. And he would just put the rags and things like that in there, and the brushes and the polish. And when he had to shine a shoe, he would just flip the bucket over. The person would put their foot and use that as something to a block that they can rest their foot on while he shined their shoes. Served its purpose. It was well, but it looked a little bit out of place. And the guys were busting his balls a little bit, messing around with him. Some of the other guys, primarily Sal, and he was telling him, hey, you look more like a shoeshine, more of a window washer than a shoeshine boy. You keep carrying that bucket around all the time. We're going to start calling you buckets. And, all the other kids kind of jump in, the way kids do, and they start giving him a hard time. And Jimmy goes on to tell Pamela all about, and that was it. The name stuck from there. From that point on, we always refer to Liam as Buckets. And he didn't like it at first, he would fight back, and the way boys do, all good natured fun and stuff, just busting each other's chops, so to speak. But he tells the story about first, Liam didn't like it, then he got used to it, and as he got older, it stuck with him, and he actually he seemed like he liked it. He was actually proud of that name, Buckets. And it stuck with him till the very end. Buckets, he was always known from that point on as Buckets. And then there was Pat. Pat, again, another very dysfunctional family, large Irish family, parents drinkers. That was pretty common back then. Didn't have much as well. But again, rough kid, tough. Not quite as big and strong and tough as Sal, but he had a lot of heart. And, he wasn't afraid of anything, and he was in and out of trouble a good bit. And it was one of the crew and got on well with all the boys. But these 5 boys, Jimmy, Mick, Sal, Buckets, and Pat, they were immensely close, really close, did everything together. And he's telling the story about, we're going around and we're trying to hustle and make some money. And they're giving Buckets a hard time, and all of a sudden they look up and they see, parked in front of this bar called the Pride of Eire, is this pink convertible Cadillac. Beautiful car. It just stands out. there's nothing else on that street that stands out more than this pink Cadillac. And it's parked directly in front of this bar, again, the Pride of Eire. And all the boys see it at the same time, and they're like, shit, do you know whose car that is? And, of course, everybody knows whose car that is. That car belongs to Tommy Egan. Now, Tommy Egan, well, he's a bit of a legend in the neighborhood. He's not a kid. He's a grown man. He's a gangster. He's a thug. Very vicious, very well known, always in the papers, always being written up about either assaulting somebody or being arrested for something or being considered a suspect in some crime that's going on. But he is the biggest thug gangster on the south side in their neighborhood anyway. And they all know who Tommy Egan is. They've never met him, but everybody sees him from time to time driving around in the car. They read about him in the paper. They, people are always telling stories, about, Tommy Egan did this, or did you hear what Tommy Egan did, type of thing. So Mick, being a little bit more nervous, he says to the guys, hey, come on, let's just keep walking. There's plenty other bars down the street that we can go to. And that's another thing, too. Actually, they've kind of crossed into a territory that they shouldn't be in. And again, this is all covered in the chapter in a lot more detail. But this particular part of the South Side belongs to some older boys. And their leader is called a guy named McGuire. And McGuire, he's a few years older than them. He's about 15, 16. Not quite a man yet, but he could pass for one. He's a big guy. And it's very simple. You don't do work in his neighborhood. You don't shine shoes. You don't cut grass. You don't do anything without him getting some peace. He just basically extorts all the other kids. He's not at the stage where he's extorting businesses or grown men yet, but he's on his way. He's definitely going to wind up becoming some type of criminal or gangster or some involvement in organized crime. He's making his way there now. But they're afraid that not so much afraid, but they're very aware that they're in McGuire's territory. And if they get caught shining shoes in there, well, chances are they're going to get a beating. But anyway, back to Tommy Egan. So Mick is like, come on, there's plenty other bars down the street. Besides, where do you, taking enough chance, enough risk being in McGuire's territory. Let's just skip this bar, go down the road. And Jimmy's very determined. Even at a young age, he's 13 years old, but he's like, fuck that. I came out today to make some money. I'm going to go in there. There's money in that bar. I can sense it. I'm going in to go ahead and make my money. You guys can come with me, or you can just wait out here, or you could move on, whatever you want to do. But I came out to make some money, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. So he just goes and he walks right through the front door into the bar. 3 seconds later, who comes running in behind him? Mick and the other three boys. So all five of them come into this bar, and there's a big guy behind the bar. He's an older guy, but he's well dressed, presentable. Even though he's middle aged, probably in his early 50s or something around this stage. But he's big, and you could tell in his day, well, he was probably a scary guy. But he just takes a look at him. He's used to Shoeshine Boys coming in and out. He doesn't really pay much attention to something like that. It's not that big thing. The bar's relatively busy. It's evening time coming into, it's probably about 5, 6 o'clock. Guys getting off work, doing construction, things like that, having a drink after work, getting a bite to eat, whatever. So the bar it's not jam-packed or anything, but it's busy enough. So the other four boys kind of scatter out, and they start approaching people, asking them if they want to shine. Jimmy heads right to the back, and as he's heading to the back, in the far back of the bar, there's a booth in the table, and there's a guy sitting at that table, drinking a Budweiser, has a leather jacket on. Big, scary looking guy. And he's watching a baseball game. And he's smoking a cigarette, drinking his Budweiser, watching the game. And Jimmy knows it right away. It's Tommy Egan. So he gets a little bit nervous, but he faces his fear, walks right up to Tommy Egan, says, "Shine, sir." And Tommy Egan stops, turns around, looks at him, takes a drag of his cigarette, exhales it out, says, "Yeah, sure, I'll take a shine, kid." And he's positioned in the booth in such a way that his legs are under the table. So he takes his left foot out, and he slides it out from outside the table onto the floor. And Jimmy sees, he's wearing boots. I guess they're like a motorcycle type of boot, even though he drives a Cadillac. But they're thick leather boots anyway. And Jimmy said, "Well, I'm going to have to charge a little bit extra for the boots if that's okay." And Tommy Egan just kind of laughs it off and says, "Yeah, go ahead, kid, no problem." And he goes back to, drinking his Budweiser, having his beer, and watching the baseball game. And the other boys are going around doing their thing. So Jimmy puts down his shoeshine box, takes out his rags, his brushes, his polish, taps Tommy Egan's boot, tells him to put his foot up on the plank on the top of the shoeshine box, so he can go ahead and give it a good brush down and clean it up and prepare to start shining it. So that's what he's doing. He's going ahead and he's preparing, giving a quick brush down, all the things you got to do when you shine a shoe. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he could see the door open, and two men walk in. Now, these two men, they're not like anybody else in the bar. They're cops, but they're not uniform cops. They're detectives. You could tell by the cheap suits. They're not wise guys or anything like that. They're primarily just wearing a cheap suit. You could tell by the shoes they're cops. You could see the holster on the, where their gun and badge is on the side, and they come in and they walk right up to Tommy Egan. Hey guys, before I continue with the story, I just want to ask you to do me a big favor here. If you could just please like and subscribe to the channel, it would mean so much to me. It really helps me out. I'm trying to build a channel here. And also too, if you can leave a comment as far as what do you like about this chapter? What don't you like about this chapter? Again, I haven't published a book yet. I've written all 39 chapters. It's ready to go. However, there's still time to make changes. So if you have an idea that you think would be really good fit for this story, or if you don't really like something, it doesn't add up, it doesn't make sense, whatever reason, if I make the edit, if I make the change, I'll acknowledge you in the book. So leave that comment, give me a thumbs up, give me a thumbs down, and I want to thank you in advance. So the two detectives walk directly up to Tommy Egan, and they stand in front of him, and Tommy doesn't pay too much attention to him. He obviously knows that they're there, but he's not going to be rattled. And there's one of them's an older detective, and one is, well, he's a younger guy, probably 20 years younger, and he's a big, strong, bullish-looking guy. Got a bit of a chip on his shoulder. And, but the older guy, he's more polished. He's been around longer, and he knows how to deal with Tommy. He's had encounters with Tommy before. So he says to Tommy, he goes, "Hey, Tommy, I think we need to have a talk." And, primarily, Tommy just takes a drag of his cigarette, sip of his beer, and, he's like, "What can I do for you? What do we need to chat about?" And the older detective turns around to the younger detective, and he says something like, "Why don't you take a walk over and check the liquor license is up to date, and maybe have a look around, see if there's any violations." Primarily, he just wants to de-escalate the situation. He knows that this younger cop detective has got a little bit of a chip on his shoulder, and he knows that's not going to go down well with Tommy. So the detective, the younger detective, kind of reluctantly walks away, and he goes over to the bar, and the bartender, this guy from earlier, the guy behind the bar, the older guy, starts talking to him. But the one thing about the guy behind the bar, he's very aware of what's going on. Even though he's talking to this younger detective, he's still got his ears perked, and he's trying to listen to what's going on, with Tommy and this other detective. And Jimmy is there, still working away. They don't even really pay too much attention to him. And Tommy turns to the older detective when the other younger guy walks away, and he says to him, "Step into my office," and he just kind of points opposite to the, into the booth, opposite side of the table. So the detective sits down, he slides in. Jimmy is still there, shining away on the boot. And the detective says to Tommy, "Tommy, we need to talk about Spider Murphy." And Tommy's just like, "Spider Murphy? What do you want to talk to me about that piece of shit about?" And the detective's like, "Well, funny thing is, he was found dead in his apartment today. He was shot in the head, which appears to look like it was a small caliber bullet, 22. And, well, I just want to ask you a couple questions about it." And Tommy just kind of shrugs it off. He says, "Look, everybody knows that Spider and I were not friends. There's no love lost there. And I hate to say it, I don't want to speak ill of the dead, but, the world's probably a better place without that piece of shit. It sounds to me like, maybe he just couldn't take it anymore. Poor Spider. He wasn't strong enough. He took the coward's way out." Kind of implying that, well, it sounds like Spider killed himself. And detective says, "Well, that's one theory. But I think it'd be a little bit hard to prove because at the time, he was tied to a chair. So let's see, shot himself in the head, sat down, and then tied himself to a chair. I don't think that theory is going to hold water." And Tommy just kind of shrugs it off and says, "I don't know. What do you want from me?" Type of thing. And the detective just goes on to say, "Look, Tommy, it's no secret in the neighborhood that Spider was into you for a lot of money. See, Spider was a degenerate gambler. And Tommy takes, a lot of the action in the neighborhood. And seemingly he owed Tommy a lot of money. And Tommy's not the type of guy that you want to owe a lot of money to, unless you can pay him. But if you can't pay him, well, that's when you run into problems." And but Tommy's just like, "Don't know what you're talking about," just blowing it off, no big thing. And the whole time that they're going back and forth talking about Spider Murphy being tied to a chair and shot in the head, Jimmy's still working away, and he's listening. But then something caught his eye. As he went to start working on Tommy's other boot, because remember he had the left foot out on the first one out from under the table. The right one was still under the table. So Jimmy starts to kind of lean in to give it a brush down, and he notices something. He notices a holster in the boot, on the side of the boot, with a small little 22 caliber gun, which appears to be, he's not a gun expert, obviously, he's just a kid, but he's been around enough to know a 22 is a small enough gun, and there's a small gun in the boot of Tommy Egan. And, he's a bright kid, you don't have to be that bright to know that Tommy's being questioned by a detective about shooting somebody with a 22 pistol. And lo and behold, there's a 22 pistol in the boot, in his boot. But he's under the table, halfway. He's kind of sticking out a little bit, but he's working away on the boot underneath. and the other detective is still behind looking at stuff with the bartender. And the detective is opposite of Tommy, and his focus is purely on Tommy Egan, the opposite side of the table. So for whatever reason, Jimmy just makes a bold move. He gets a rag. He picks up a rag that he had for shining the boots. He places it in his hand, puts it on the gun to cover it up, and just slides it out. He then takes it. He quickly wraps it up under the table, puts it in his shoeshine box, gathers up all his other stuff, his brushes and polish and everything else, pops up, stands up very quickly with all his stuff in his shoeshine box in his hand, and he says, "I'm all done, mister." And both Tommy and the detective are kind of startled a little bit. Not scared, obviously, but just kind of caught off guard because there's such an intense conversation going on about Spider Murphy. They forgot that Jimmy was there. Well, pretty much forgot about it. They surely weren't paying attention to him anyway. So Tommy just goes and looks down, takes a look at his boots. He goes, "Nice job, kid." Goes in his pocket, pulls out a thick wad of cash, peels off a $5 bill, and hands it to Jimmy. And Jimmy just wants out of there. He's scared. He's a kid. He's got Tommy Egan's gun in his shoeshine box, and there's a detective there and another one coming. And speaking of, at this time, the younger detective comes and he comes back, and he's standing now at the table. And Jimmy just walks right past him. And as he's walking past him, the older detective, slides out from the booth, joins the younger detective, and says, "Tommy, come on, we're going to need you to take a ride down to the station to answer some questions for us." And Tommy just looks at him and takes a moment and says, "Well, what happens if I don't feel like taking a drive with you, detective?" And as soon as he says that, the bartender, the old guy behind the bar, joins in. And he says, "Tommy, we don't need any trouble here. You go with the detectives. You do what they say. We don't want to be causing any problems in my place." And Tommy just relaxes and he says, "Take it easy, Sean. I'm only messing with them. Of course I'm going to go down to the station with them. No problem, officer." Stands up, and when he stands up, you could see what a big man he is. He stands a good 5-6 inches over the detective, and just as broad as can be. Just a scary looking thug of a man. And he turns around, puts his hands behind his back. They take out the cuffs. They put the cuffs on him. They start as they're cuffing him. Jimmy joined his 4 friends, and they're all at the front door, and they're all just in shock, looking what's unfolding in front of them. I mean, you got Tommy Egan, detectives, being handcuffed, all right in front of them. So the bartender, supposedly, I guess his name is Sean, we find out now, he just turns to him and says, "Okay, boys, that's enough excitement for one day now. Go on, be gone." And he kind of just waves them off. So they go, they exit the door onto the street, and the second that Jimmy hit the sidewalk, he takes off running. The other 4 boys come running behind him. They run down the block, they go into an alleyway, and they kind of perch down behind a dumpster. Well, that's what Jimmy does. The other guys follow him. He kind of crawls in behind a dumpster to kind of hide, and he puts his shoebox down, and the boys are just, wow. They're just like so pumped up about what they saw. So I was like, fuck, did you ever see anything that cool in your entire life? And like Buckets and is like, Jesus Christ, I thought Tommy Egan was going to start fighting with those cops right there in front of us. They just can't believe what they saw there. And then Jimmy's like, hey, settle down. I got to show you something. And he opens up the box, the shoeshine box. He takes out the rag with the gun, and he holds it. He folds back the rag, and they see it. And all of their eyes just light up. But in different ways. Mick looks scared. Again, Mick is sensible. He knows this is trouble. He right away, he could put two and two together. He knows that there's something that this is not going to be a good thing for them. And Sal is excited. Sal right away, like, being Sal, he reaches forward, to kind of grab the gun, because he wants to hold it, because that's Sal, that's who he is. And, but right away, Mick just kind of slaps his hand out of the way, pushes it out of the way. He says, don't fucking touch that. You don't want your prints on that thing. And, because again, Mick is a smart guy. But all the boys are all just like kind of shocked and excited and scared and don't know what to think. And Buckets says to Jimmy, where the fuck did you get that? And that's when Jimmy tells him. He says, I took it off Tommy Egan. Then it was just like, oh my God. Are you crazy? You stole that gun from Tommy Egan. He's going to kill you. And, of course, all this is primarily coming from Mick, the sensible one. And, Sal's like, don't be worrying about Tommy Egan. Right now, he's in the back of that cop car on his way down to the 8th District. Chances are he's going to be thrown in a cell, and he's going to have some fat detective's knee on his neck while, 3 other cops kick the living shit out of him. And, but then Pat's like, yeah, well, what happens tomorrow when he gets out? He's going to come looking for you, Jimmy. And the question is, why did you take it? And Jimmy's like, I don't know. I was shining the boot. The detective is talking to Tommy, and he starts talking about this guy, Spider Murphy, being found shot dead in the head. And then the boy's like, shot dead in the head? Tied to a chair. He's obviously, he suspects Tommy of actually killing this guy. And all of a sudden I see this gun. And I don't know. I was scared. I thought, what's Tommy going to do? Is he going to pull out the gun, start shooting? I don't know what. I don't even know what I was thinking, but I just took the gun. I had the opportunity. I saw it. I just took it. Put it in my box. And then Sal's like, that was a good move, man. That was smart. And, Mick is just shaking his head like, this is bad to Jimmy. This is not going to end well. And they're all like, well, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And Jimmy's like, I just need some time to think. Let's get back to the clubhouse. And the clubhouse is just some garage primarily behind Pat's house that they kind of converted into their clubhouse. They got a heavy bag in there and some weights that they work out in, and they hang out there. An old stereo that they got someplace, beat up couch that he found in an alley, that type of thing. And he's like, let's meet up at the clubhouse. We'll split up. You guys take the alley. Me and Mick are going to go on the street. We don't want to have too many guys on the street in case some cops come by and they see a gang of kids walking down the street. And they decide to pull us over to just a question to see what we're up to. So, okay, that's what they do. They all, and the truth is, the reason Jimmy wanted to just go back with Mick is because, again, he just needed a calm environment, somebody with a bit of sense, he just needed a bit of quiet, and he needed time to think. This is a heavy move. He's got to figure out what's he going to do with this gun. What's he going to do about Tommy Egan? What's he going to do about the cops? A lot going on for a young kid to be dealing with. So he explains that to Mick. He's like, hey, I just needed a moment just to get my head together. And Mick understands. They love the boys, but they know that the boys, they can be a little bit much sometimes. They're boys. They're 13-year-old kids, and they're tough kids. They're easily excited, I suppose, and they don't always think as logically as maybe Jimmy or Mick do. So Mick just says, "Look, we're here now. This situation, we'll figure it out. Don't worry about it." And again, that's why Jimmy and Mick are so close. You know, they always have each other's back. And the other guys do too, don't get me wrong. But there's just a tighter connection you could tell with Mick and Jimmy. And they're more aligned, I suppose. And so they just start walking back to the clubhouse, and the boys go on through the alley. And then later on, they meet up at the clubhouse. And they're all sitting around this club, sitting around the ground. The shoeshine box is in the middle of the floor. And, the gun is there, in the box. The box is opened up. The gun is just sitting in the box. And they're all just looking at this gun. And they're like, what are we going to do? Jimmy thinks, and he says, I decided what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring the gun back to Tommy. And Pat is like, are you fucking nuts? Maybe he won't even know that you took it. Maybe he won't know what happened to the gun. And then they're just like, come on. Of course he's going to know. You're there shining his boots. The gun goes missing. He's going to know you took the gun. And then they're saying, well, what if he never gets out? What if he's locked up? What if he doesn't get out? It might be a good thing. It's like, and then Sal's like, well, hey, we can use the gun. So I don't know what we can use it for, but look, it's better to have a gun and not need it than need it and not have it. In his logic anyway. But Jimmy's like, no, I've already made up my mind. If he gets out, I'm going to bring the gun back. And right away, Sal says, well, if you go, I'm going with you. Because he's got, Sal is loyal and he's tough and he's not afraid of anything. But, I mean, again, he's a little bit afraid of Tommy Egan, I think. But he's willing to face that fear. And he's not going to let his friend Jimmy walk back in there on his own. And so he says, if Tommy Egan's going to kick your ass, he's going to have to kick mine too. And then Bucket sits up and he's like, me too. Count me in. Pat says, well, yeah, I guess so. And you can count on me as well. It's like, if you're going to get your ass kicked, I'm going to be with you. Because again, these guys are tight. And then they all kind of look to Mick. And Mick just says, I knew hanging around with you fucking guys is going to get me killed one day. Like that. He goes, yeah, I'm in. So they all agree that they're going to go back. If Tommy Egan gets out of the station anyway, gets out of the being questioned, which they don't have really. I don't know how much evidence they have, but they don't have the gun now. That's a good thing. I don't know what evidence they do have, but if he does get out, Jimmy says he's going to go back. So right away, they all agree that they're going to go back, and that's when Sal's the first one. He says, together to the end, guys, and he puts his hand in, and then or Buckets goes and puts his hand on top of it. After Pat does it, all the boys do. Mick does it. And then they just look to Jimmy. Jimmy puts his hand on top at the end and says, yeah, together to the end. That's how tight these kids are. From a young age, they always stick together. So that's where Jimmy kind of, ends the story to Pamela. Because he can see out of the corner of his eye that the guard is out there. And he's kind of looking in, and Pamela catches it as well. She looks at her watch and she goes, I think we'll have to end it there. Can we pick up on this story next week? And Jimmy's like, I've got nothing else to do. No place better to be, type of thing. So that's where it's going to end for this chapter, in chapter 6. It's going to continue on, and it's going to start getting a lot more exciting, because now what we're going to start doing, we're going to start kind of building on. We're going to see from a young age how these kids, 13-year-old kids, go from shining shoes to basically getting involved with the underworld and eventually becoming one of the most powerful crime organizations on the south side of Chicago. And it all starts with Jimmy taking that gun from Tommy Egan. So don't miss next week. Okay? Until then, stay focused, stay strong, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Okay? Thanks, guys.